Welcome to the Energy Summit. This is our session on carbon capture, utilization, and storage by me. I'd like to start by putting Matt's wind conversation into context. He talked a lot about energy transition in the context of Europe. I'll expand that out a little bit more into a global context. And then I want to take you through what's happening in carbon capture and storage. Carbon capture, utilization, and storage, actually. And that world is evolving so fast as well. And I know that pretty much all of the customers that we have represented today have efforts going on in carbon capture as well to some extent. The conversation from energy transition perspective almost always kind of originates from some kind of slide like this. This particular slide comes from the International Energy Agency, and this is publicly available. You can go looking for International Energy Agency and all the reports and stuff that they bring out in terms of how the energy mixes are changing. And this is really what I've kind of built some of my explanation around. You'll notice this kind of expands out globally. Some of the specific energy sectors that Mads referenced, you'll notice that wind and solar is definitely the biggest one. But the other thing I want to draw to your attention, and I mentioned this at the top, is that if you look at 2020, or maybe a little bit to the right of that, 2022, the volume of fossil fuel energy is actually over 80%. And if you actually look at the numbers, it's more specifically in 2020 when I kind of pegged this chart initially. It's 84% fossil fuel-based oil, gas, and coal, and 16% renewables. And there's a few other nuances in there in terms of hydro and nuclear and some of the others that fall into the renewables category. But this is roughly the split, right? What Matt's talked about, and this again is based on this IEA projections of net zero for global, and Matt's is talking about EU, but for global, they expect that shift is going to have to actually invert, basically, right? So that oil and gas will be 21% in 2050 and 79% will be renewables. That's a massive, massive change in the energy dynamic. And I'll talk to you a little bit about kind of what that means from a percentage growth perspective just in the next few years, right? It's really significant. And I'll leave you with these slides. We're going to have all the slides available to you, and you can also go back in the recording, obviously, to have a look at this. What I want to talk about is the next piece here, which is carbon capture and storage. If we're going to mitigate what we're experiencing today with fossil fuels, and it's going to be really, really difficult to make that transition away from oil, gas, and coal. Anybody who says that we just need to shut down all oil production just doesn't have a grasp of what's actually going on in the economies today around the world. I get the emotional desire to do that by some people, but it's just not practical. And most of you are intimately familiar with that. And so what we need to do is figure out how do we get the oil and gas production to a net zero state and more sustainable moving forward. And that's where a lot of the carbon capture investment is happening. When Cisco looks at kind of where the opportunity is in terms of where the growth and investments are, this is kind of what you see. There's probably 4 areas that oil and gas companies are working with most in terms of energy transition. And Mads already referenced wind and solar. That's massive, right? And I've got the annual growth projections there for wind and solar being in that 30% range annually for the next 8 or 9 years, right? And that's pretty much right now. So you're going to see massive investments there. We're seeing a similar number, actually a much bigger number in EV charging. That market is expected to grow, 46% in the next few years. And the carbon capture number is even higher, right? So 50% annual growth in carbon capture and storage is going to be needed in order to hit those targets that we need. Even with the oil and gas volumes dropping as dramatically as that graph showed, we're still going to need a massive increase in carbon capture and storage investment. And we are seeing that. There's a lot of people that are investing a ton in carbon capture and storage. Now, there's other factors here as well. Probably the biggest one that I don't talk about just because oil and gas companies haven't invested there is the utility grids. I'm not 100% sure why oil and gas companies haven't actually invested in that. It seems like a really good parallel to the pipeline kind of transport idea. That maybe the production companies would be interested in generation, and the midstream companies would be interested in utility grids, because the downstream companies are definitely reaching into EV charging. So, but we haven't seen that move to utility grids at all yet. If some of you are involved in that, let me know, and I can. We have tons of resources around how to modernize utility grids, and we've got a lot of work going on in that. We have a whole utility practice similar to the oil and gas practice that I'm working with for utility grids. There's a couple others that we're watching. Hydroelectric and nuclear are obviously big, but they do not change very fast. There's some other big ones that could be massive in the years to come, but we're not seeing production scale investment yet, right? Hydrogen is very close. Power storage is very close. Bioenergy and geothermal are probably a lot more niche than the others, but they also talk a big game. And so these will probably hit mainstream here in the next while, and we will also be publishing those as our customers grow in that space. Okay. Matt's already talked about some of the growth curves, and I mentioned some of the growth requirements that are going to be needed. And so I'm not gonna go beyond that, but I want to talk to you about carbon capture and kind of how that world works for the next 15 minutes or so. I just built out this slide because I think it's good to look at the whole thing. There's a lot of pieces to this ecosystem, and in part it's due to who is actually tackling the problem. When you see oil and gas companies tackle the opportunity of carbon capture, they tend to break it into pieces that are similar to what oil and gas operates as. And I'll talk about that in a graph form a little bit later on. But then there's also other independent, kind of more research-oriented carbon capture initiatives that are much more contained, or they go at it differently, and they only use a subset of these, or they integrate some of these components together to make it less complex and more modular, right? So I'll talk about that in a minute as well. But from a capture perspective, there's a few different strategies that are happening today. There's capture at combustion, which is probably the biggest volume contributor at this point. This is just capture technology that's being put into any kind of plant that uses uses fossil fuel combustion to operate. And so the exhaust gases are then processed to pull out the carbon dioxide, and then they are kind of pushed off into the rest of the ecosystem. But the capture part is really from that combustion process. Then there's a whole nother area of research going on with direct air capture. And the idea here is that you could put this direct air capture anywhere in the world, and anywhere in the geography, and it'll pull CO2 out of the air. And because of the diffusion within the atmosphere, the CO2 equalizes, right? So you can really do this anywhere, and it's going to impact everywhere, right? So that's a direct air capture component. This ends up being a little bit more difficult to do, but you can see the attraction, right? Is that because you can build it anywhere, it's not dependent on connecting with one of the consumers of oil and gas. Another very innovative idea that's just starting to grow momentum is ocean CO2 capture. And I don't think this has seen it worked its way into the oil and gas ecosystem at all, so we won't talk about it a whole lot today. It's much more of a kind of closed system, but it's a really innovative idea where they're pulling CO2 out of the ocean, and the same diffusion idea that I talked about earlier, actually, it's real in the ocean as well, right? So if you pull CO2 out of the ocean, it will actually pull in CO2 from the air to compensate for the CO2 that got pulled out of the ocean. And so it's actually just as effective as pulling the CO2 out of the air or capturing it somewhere else. So I think all three of these capture mechanisms are going to grow, and there's probably going to be new ones that come up. But then once the CO2 has been captured, unless you have an integrated system that immediately turns it into some kind of storage mechanism, you're going to have some type of a transport processing kind of mechanism, right? So typically in an oil and gas environment, you're going to see that transition into pipelines, and that pipeline system will have some type of temporary storage associated with it. You do see some vehicle transport happening where there's not pipelines in place, but they would typically be transported to a storage facility somewhere and put into a tank where it can then be taken with a pipeline through for either for further processing or to a storage facility. The processing component is interesting. In some cases, it's as simple as just compressing the gas so that it is more efficiently stored or more efficiently transported. But there's a lot of other processing components that are starting to emerge as well in terms of converting CO2 to feedstock for various industrial processes, or even converting CO2 into solid waste, which can be stored in a more in a different way. It doesn't have to be sequestered in the same way that CO2 does directly, right? And then storage, if you get into the storage side of it, depending on how it's been processed, you may be putting the CO2 directly back into the reservoirs that the oil came out of, right? And there's a variation of that occurs in a lot of oil and gas environments today, where they use that process to actually enhance oil recovery and make it more efficient to pump oil out of the ground. And then there's production of products and all that kind of thing that can be used to sequester the CO2. Matt's talked about the pricing and incentives a little bit already, but I wanted to spend a bit of time on this slide here to give you an idea of the components, right? So one example of how that lays itself out is carbon capture happening at refineries, chemical plants, anything that really combusts oil and gas product. And then the CO2 is captured there and put into feeder pipelines, which makes its way to hub facilities or broker type companies, and then delivers that through pipelines to storage and utilization facilities. And so this whole ecosystem or supply chain has to be paid for by the CO2 carbon price. And you noticed maybe in Matt's drawing, the price was somewhere around $60. I think that price came from October or November. You see the prices kind of fluctuated, but it's up over $80 now. Actually, not dollars. This is EU currency, and so 80 to 100 EU euros because that's, I think, where the most stable pricing structure has been established. In most other places, it's still less market based, but certainly that's where we're going, is a market price for carbon, and then this whole ecosystem has to be paid for by that price. So let's talk a little bit about one example of how this works, right? Any of you watched my carbon capture and storage video on YouTube will recognize this drawing sequence. But I want to point out something about this sequence that's kind of interesting for oil and gas people, because in this case, we have CO2 sourcing at the plant. We have it going through a pipeline to terminals, and then we have it going through another pipeline, say, to a permanent storage location. What's really fascinating about this is that this really follows the downstream, midstream, upstream model of oil and gas, right? Just in reverse, right? So if you took away the CO2 reference here and you took away the numbering system, this could be an oil production drawing, right? Where you have oil production happening in upstream, goes through the pipeline to terminals, and then it goes through another pipeline to refineries, right? So this is just reversing that whole process and starting with the refinery and moving back to the production area. And so none of that really is new. It's just the order is reversed, right? The only thing that's really fundamentally new is the carbon capture piece, and that's right now is the most expensive part. And so there's tons of research going into the actual carbon capture component. But the other pieces that are also required for this are all pretty well understood and really follow a lot of the best practices that you are already familiar with in the oil and gas industry. Are we getting any questions or comments, Joe, that I should be aware of?
No, nothing unaddressed.
Okay. We're either keeping people wrapped in attention or they're off doing emails or something. But definitely, if you have any questions, ping me. If you're watching this after the fact, definitely reach out to anybody on the team here to clarify any of these pieces. But I also recognize that a lot of people, this is kind of an academic thing, and they're not necessarily involved in this process yet. But hopefully, it sets the stage for some of the discussions within the carbon capture world. The last piece I want to talk about in the carbon capture ecosystem is integrated systems. And this, by and large, is not in the oil and gas world, but it's an important part of the carbon capture world. And this example here that I have for you on this page actually is that ocean example that I referenced earlier, where they're actually pumping ocean water out of the ocean, processing it, pulling the CO2 out, converting it into solid waste, and then pumping both the water and the solid waste back into the ocean. And I shouldn't call it waste. It's really solids that would be native to the ocean. It's just they've converted the CO2 to those solids that can just live at the bottom of the ocean. And so it's a very interesting kind of integrated system. So you're doing the capture piece, the transport piece, and the and the processing all as part of one integrated system. And we're seeing this also be the case with, say, direct air capture systems that are providing feedstock, say, to a manufacturing process, or anything that, so then in that case, if you're doing direct air capture, you don't have to be anywhere in particular. You can locate yourself right beside the factory and that's using it as feedstock. And so these integrated systems don't need all that transport that we talk about, right? They can just kind of live wherever they're needed, where the outputs are used. And so you're going to see a lot of those kinds of implementations. Quite frankly, though, there's lots to go around, right? We're not going to run out of CO2 just right away. And so if you've got a CO2 capture system in mind, there's going to be lots of market for you to go after. And really what stands out with these solutions is that they tend to be independent of anything else going on. They're not typically integrated into the oil and gas operating model in any way. They have integrated operations. They're not really dependent on other operating environments to feed their research, their expertise into this environment. It's pretty self-contained. And the other thing that's kind of unique about this approach is that it's usually modular, right? So it will be built for a particular scale, but you can also replicate it, right? So if you want 5 times as much capture going on, you can build it 5 times, right? So that's an interesting kind of approach here. Although from a scaling perspective, I don't know if this will have the same efficiencies of scale as what oil companies are used to doing in their whole production system. I think the oil and gas industry has some advantages there. So a couple of things to kind of take away from this carbon capture and storage discussion, and then we're going to move into the collaboration topics here in a second. So a lot of the carbon capture processing and use resembles a lot of the downstream best practices that we already have. Cisco has validated designs for plant infrastructure. Cisco has validated designs for a lot of things to do with plants, right? And all of that applies to the carbon capture processes that are now being adopted into plants, right? The transport of CO2 follows all the best practices that we have today for pipelines. So if you're a pipeline operator or you're a pipeline designer, all of the pipelines that are used for CO2 transport would apply here as well. That would be the second takeaway. Incidentally, I didn't talk about hydrogen, but any of the other gases that we're using for transport, hydrogen being a big one, there's some pretty significant oil and gas companies in around the world that I know are transporting hydrogen with their existing pipeline infrastructure as well. And so all the best practices that you know about from a pipeline architecture would apply for hydrogen transport as well, right? Storage and sequestration is probably most parallel to the upstream operation. So any kind of piping gas into the ground, into reservoirs. Upstream operations have been doing this already for enhanced oil recovery, and so they're very familiar with that sequestration process. They're very familiar with identifying geology signatures that work really well for that sequestration, and they're used to filing for different regulation bodies around those geological formations. So really doing that for carbon capture and storage is just one more way of using that data and information. Okay. The fourth takeaway is really a whole class of new systems that we're starting to see bubble up that I think will become more relevant across all of oil and gas, and that is integrated cloud-based systems, right? And we're going to maybe hear a little bit more from Emerson and Mozam later today about some of the instrumentation components that are becoming more cloud friendly, right? We're seeing this in solar, which is much more cloud oriented in terms of management. We're seeing it in carbon capture, where there's these integrated systems that are independent enough that they can provide the security in a cloud-based system, right? Without any kind of interaction with other systems that may not be built from the ground up to really leverage cloud in a secure way. And so these integrated systems have that advantage. They can leverage the economies of scale that come with cloud adoption. And so you're going to see some more of that happening as well, where systems can be built that are somewhat independent of everything else that's happening. They're more easily connected to cloud and managed by cloud. And we're seeing that in the solar environment a lot more than in the wind environment. And we're seeing it in carbon capture in certain sort of integrated designs. That's all I had for this. Definitely reach out to me in the Q&A and in the chat, or anybody who who's been following me on YouTube and LinkedIn. Definitely feel free to reach out to me there as well. And you're going to see me around. Welcome your information and questions.
Thank you for joining us for this session. If this session was of value to you, please like and subscribe and click on the next video. Take care.